I started reading The Making the Atomic Bomb 2 years ago, and it changed my life. I was just a grad student in QNC, which is this hexagonal shaped building on the right of our screen. And every day I walked to and from school, I listened to the audiobook of The Making of the Atomic Bomb. It's a really good history of physics, because you can't talk about nuclear physics without the history of all physics. And it made me realize that science has really changed a lot from what it used to be. Today, science has a lot more people doing it. There's a lot of scientists today. Back then, a study was done in America, and only 100 people in the early 1900s considered themselves physicists. Today, we have classes of 100 people every single day from dozens of institutions within Canada, a relatively small country. So there's a lot more people doing it, but there's also a lot more organizations running it. There's so many universities, there's private institutions, and military organizations that are running it and also funding it. So the landscape has changed immensely, and we want to ask ourselves the questions: when did science go from something that a few privileged people could do, in their basements on their free time, tinkering with, glass tubes and prisms and rays of light, to being this giant enterprise that we know today? And how did we end up with this wonderful building you see on the right, the Quantum Nano Center and the Institute of Quantum Computing? Matthew and I are going to approach this from the perspective of the making of the atomic bomb, specifically the 1 to 3 decades leading up to the Manhattan Project, because it's a very, very pivotal moment in science. Science has always been changing, but this is a particular moment when the atomic bomb was created, where it was really I'm not going to be able to say that word. It was changed without going back. Matthew, can you say that word for me?
Irrevocably.
Thank you. Was not going to be able to say that. So here are some of the questions that we're going to be asking today, with the purpose of answering why we should teach history in today's science classes. Here are 3 simple but challenging questions to answer. Is science inherently good? When did pure science become a tool for the military? And did scientists have a voice in how their knowledge would be used? Should they? We'll talk about this. Okay. So physics then was quite different. I'd like to focus on a specific event and a specific person. On the right is Ernest Rutherford, my 3rd favorite scientist of all time. He was caught telling one of his students, the pizza, that you cannot serve God and mammon at the same time. What does that mean? Mammon is a word for money, and it's usually used to describe monetary things with a negative connotation. You cannot serve God and mammon at the same time. Essentially saying, if you want to pursue science, you need to serve God, or pure science, and not commercial or military ventures. This is a value that was brought to him by his supervisor, J.J. Thomson, the man in the middle, as well as Lord Kelvin on the left. All 3 of these scientists attended the University of Cambridge, and specifically the Cavendish, which was a center for theoretical / experimental physics. It's still around today, still a world leader in physics, but back then, 130 years ago, it was the center of physics in the world. Now, Rutherford is one of the greatest experimentalists of all time, and when he was born, the year was 1871. That's the year that New Zealand was born as a nation, and he was born as a poor farmer. He spent his days milking cows, helping his father with his mill, and hunting pigeons in the bush. He was the all New Zealand man, just a big manly boy, but he also was a genius. And as he was planting and digging potatoes in the garden, he struck gold. His mother called and told him that she had just been cabled, that he'd won a scholarship to work with J.J. Thomson in Cambridge. And he threw a shovel down and said, "This is the last potato I'll ever dig." And he was right. He headed to Cambridge, and the rest is history. He won the scholarship because he wrote a very good paper on magnetizing iron with high-frequency magnetic waves. In other words, radio waves is what they were back then, not yet called that. Radio waves were all the hype in the 1880s and 1890s. And Rutherford had a knack for tinkering with things and experimenting with things. So, Matthew, by the way, will you read the things in the chat and address them?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Hard to read and talk at the same time. Okay, so Rutherford goes to Cambridge, but as a poor boy, also from a colonial state, he felt extremely out of place, embarrassed because he couldn't keep up with the coldness of the British, their class system, his embarrassing accent. It's hard to remember, but he spoke with a very aggressive Kiwi accent. And he also, as a poor boy, wanted to pursue radio to make money. Thomson tried to convince him otherwise, and Thomson had a talk with Kelvin, who was at that time Lord Kelvin, the legend himself, in which the unit of temperature is named after. Thomson said, "Before I convince Rutherford to drop radio as a commercial venture, can you just look into whether radio will actually be commercializable or not?" Kelvin, with his experience and knowledge, looked into it, got back to Thomson and said, "I think that radio is nice, and you can make a company that might earn £100,000 at most." So they didn't think radio would even make that much money. And Thomson told that to Rutherford in a dark chapel on the Cambridge University campus and said, "You need to stop this. No more serving mammon. It's time to serve God." Funny for many reasons. One, radio is very important. Rutherford could have become a millionaire. He gave up all the money that he could have made from inventing the radio in search of the atom. And we can all say quite conclusively that he won the atom. Rutherford was the most influential scientist in atomic physics of the 20th century. He discovered the proton, the nuclear model, and his students discovered most of what we have today of our nuclear model. So physics back then in the Rutherford lab was about pure science. It wasn't about having your science applicable, even for good or bad, or commercializability. It was just about finding out how God made the universe. So what made his lab so successful? Let's just take a quick look at the timeline of physics and the atom. So in the early 1800s, John Dalton had come up with the atomic model, saying that things were indivisible and matter was made of small atoms. Thomson, Rutherford, and Bohr, three men who all worked in the Cavendish between the years 1880, the last 2 decades of the 1800s, and then the first 2 decades of the 1900s, where the model of the atom exploded. We got J.J. Thomson's plum pudding model. Thomson was the discoverer of the electron. The Rutherford model, which was that the atom had a nucleus, and the Bohr model, which explained why electrons don't crash into the nucleus. Erwin Schrödinger, on the right here, was a very young man at the time that he advanced quantum mechanics in the early 1920s with his wave function. And this is quite solidly the model we have today of the atom. So 3 of these 5 iconic scientists came from one single lab in Cambridge. What was their secret? Matthew, can you ask these questions?
What you would like me to ask the question or answer the question?
Yeah, could you, if you could pick one of these, what do you think would be the biggest reason that made the Cavendish so successful?
Well, I would say that out of the 3 reasons you've given here, I'd say that the B and C, probably some combination, were the most crucial. There was a structure. Maybe I can say a bit about the structure of mentorship and apprenticeship that the physics community had in the late 19th and early 20th century, and how that led to so many of these successes.
Yes.
Life in Cambridge at the Cavendish was an almost solitary, monastic-like existence. When you were going to the Cavendish to pursue your studies in physics, you were going to join a community of mostly men who were living what we would consider a very solitary, regimented, nearly religious type of experience. They would just do physics all day, talk about their physics, hang out with the other people. Newton, who too was at Cambridge, but many centuries earlier, when once asked, how did you figure out all this physics, he said, it's all I ever think about. And that was the case for these scientists as well. They would go on occasional walks, but what would they talk about on their walks? Well, of course, physics. There was an idea, like Nat mentioned in the previous slide, about being unable to serve both God and mammon at the same time, that we were in pursuit of a higher ideal, and the crucial crux of that ideal was one based on training, mentorship, and apprenticeship. The modern research university, we can think of it in a way as an extension of the apprenticeship model that exists in so many professions, like welding or carpentry, where young people would join older people and study from them, learn from them, work from them, and then eventually become their peers and then enter into positions of power on their own right. That is precisely how the physics community and all scientific endeavor was structured as well. When we think about students pursuing PhDs under the supervision of their elders, we shouldn't think of it as some uniquely scientific phenomenon, but really it's just a model of European apprenticeship translated to the generation of knowledge about physics instead of the building of glass or the construction of machines, or for that matter, painting or art as the primary activity. So it was no exception here that the level of close contact, mentorship, and the sheer strength of the community of the people pursuing this work was absolutely fundamental to its success. And that's what made so many people from so many parts of the world want to join this community and, as we will soon discuss, want to come to Cambridge to work with so many of these legends, because the in-person training that they could receive there, it cannot be matched by a textbook. Just the amount of tacit and community-held knowledge that is required for one to do physics makes it really crucial that this activity all be done in person under strong community collaboration and mentorship, and that is a fundamental part of this physics community, and that, as we'll soon see, accounts for a lot of its strength and its persistence throughout time, even though there have been forces in the world that have tried to basically destroy it. So back to you, Nat.
Yeah, let's comment on that for just another second. So there was a study done, I think in the second decade of the 1900s, that asked, what is a physicist? I think Einstein had just become famous for his theory of relativity. Physics was kind of cool to talk about in the news because we had crazy theories like relativity. What even is that? Apparently, time can be dilated, lengths can be contracted, and the news and the media and the public loved it. So there was kind of like a love affair. People started thinking about, okay, what are these quirky people they call physicists? And the study concluded that a lot of the physicists in America had kind of a lack of mentorship growing up, a lack of a father figure, and would call their own supervisor in their lab their father. And this is really exemplary. Ernest Rutherford mentored dozens of students in his time at the Cavendish. 11 of them were Nobel laureates. That's a record held to today. And they all called him Papa. I don't think anyone today would call their supervisor daddy. That's not a thing you'd see. So it was just a thing of the times. Rutherford was the daddy of the Cavendish, and he mentored 11 Nobel laureates. Can I just go over a list real quick? Here are some highlights. Okay, Frederick Soddy. When Rutherford and Soddy were doing a placement at McGill University, actually, shout out to Montreal. They had discovered alpha and beta radiation as being just helium nuclei and electrons, and they developed a theory of radioactive decay that was imperative for all radiation physics thereafter. Rutherford then also mentored Hans Geiger, who invented the Geiger counter. He also mentored Ernst Marsden, who ran the experiment with Geiger, who found out it was the famous gold foil experiment that discovered the nucleus. He mentored Bohr. Bohr did a fellowship at Cambridge with Rutherford. And Bohr had a really terrible time when he first arrived at the Cavendish. He actually was supposed to do his first work under J.J. Thomson, who was still kind of, in the olden days, not that much of a nice, warm father figure, quite cold. There's some letters between Bohr and his brother where Bohr explains about how happy he is to be at the Cavendish and how he hopes that J.J. will like him. And it's quite endearing. However, J.J. did not like him because Bohr spoke his mind and his new theories were kind of going against what J.J. had built up. You know, there was an impending revolution in physics and the quantum mechanics. And so Bohr was not doing so well until he found Rutherford, a warm, enthusiastic fellow who was open to talking about physics and mentorship and would support his students. And he thrived under Rutherford, creating the Bohr-Rutherford model. Bohr, with Moseley, who pioneered X-ray spectroscopy, discovered much about the place of elements on the periodic table, linking them to atomic number. Mark Oliphant, who helped discover tritium and a lot about particle acceleration. And Otto Hahn, who was the world's greatest nuclear chemist, who eventually would discover uranium fission. Those are just some of the highlights of who Rutherford mentored. He was great. Okay, let's take a quick move on. This is just an iconic. This is a conference photo. Could you imagine being at a conference and seeing these people here? Matthew, would you mind if we just took a moment? Let's see if people in the chat think this is as iconic with us. If you see someone's name who you recognize as discovering something, could you put it in the chat? I'm gonna go first. I won't take the easiest one. Yep.
Where is this? What is this?
This is the 1927 Solvay Conference, a conference held in Europe.
Belgium.
Thank you. Where they would gather the greatest minds of chemistry and physics of the time to talk. And there was a lot of debate going on. This wasn't just them taking a photo off. Please send your questions to all panelists. So Matthew. Oh, yes. Great. Thank you. Okay. So there was a lot of debate and talk that went on at these conferences. This specific one was quite iconic. In 1927, Heisenberg, the young boyish figure in the back, see the top row, back right, Heisenberg, he was young. He was, I think, 25 when he made the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. He's 25. Matthew, what have you done with your life?
Not nearly as much.
Literally done nothing.
Maybe we could say a bit about just the generational difference that is evident in this photo. I mean, the Solvay conferences were a regular event. Solvay was a patron of science who funded a regular meeting in Belgium, but they started before World War I, and there was a break due to the war, and then they soon resumed after. But you can see the kind of evolution of this group of people who are participating. In the front row, you can see kind of the old heads. There's Max Planck, who was instrumental in pointing out some of the flaws in thermodynamic theory that enabled Einstein to propose a particle theory of light. Lorentz, of the famous Lorentz contraction, who equally had a theory of special relativity along with Einstein. Of course, Marie Curie. And then this generation of physicists, you can see them in the earlier Solvay conferences. For instance, if you look at the photo of the 1913 Solvay conference, all of those people are there. By the way, the Solvay conferences are still continuing to this day. But what we see in this photo is actually the emergence of a new generation of physicists who are quite a bit younger and who would go on to really revolutionize physics with quantum mechanics. As Nat mentioned, we have the young Heisenberg back there. You can see Paul Dirac, a kind of shy, reclusive kind of figure in the middle there, Schrodinger, and many others. And for a while, the theory of quantum mechanics was known colloquially or in jest as Knabenphysik, which is the German word to mean youth physics or child's physics, because it was seen that this was kind of the new physics for the kids. This wasn't the serious adult physics. This was just the radical new physics. But it's interesting to see in this photo alone that that kind of intergenerational representation is seen, and there's something of a passing of the torch taking place.
Yeah, at this particular conference, every day Einstein would come up and say, okay, well, maybe there's some uncertainty in physics, but his famous line is, God does not play dice. And Bohr, frustrated with Einstein's sort of solid grasp, concrete grasp of what physics should be, would argue with him. Bohr and Heisenberg would come up with many examples that would counter Einstein's examples of uncertainty. They'd go to sleep, and the next day, they'd be back at it. And they spent 5 days in a row of pure arguing between every single talk. Every meal was an argument. There was a lot of debate between the generations there.
One other notable thing about both Bohr and Einstein, and many of the people in this photo, is that many were extremely philosophically minded. These scientists were not content to just learn their math and keep quiet. They were all extremely philosophically literate, which I think gives us, reason to pause and question why philosophy and the philosophy of science is not necessarily an integral part of most contemporary scientific educations, when many of our academic scientific heroes who have really shaped the way that the field that we work in is done viewed philosophy as central to their work.
Right, that's right. And Angela in the chat just brought up a really good point, saying that she doesn't think she'd be invited, being a woman and half Asian. I think you have a good point, Angela. If you look at the demographics here, they don't look very good for anyone who isn't an old white man. We will talk about the importance of openness and inclusivity in science quite soon, actually. So if we keep that in mind, shall we move on? Oh, sorry. Shall we move on? We good, Matthew?
Yes, I think we might have to pick up the pace a little bit because at this rate.
I agree. Okay, so in picking up the pace, here is sort of the brief timeline of particle physics. Let's not spend too much time on this. We talked about the late 1800s and the discovery of radioactivity, X-rays, and alpha particles. We talked about J.J. Thomson's discovery of electrons, Albert Einstein, who not only got his Nobel Prize for relativity, but another Nobel Prize, Brownian motion, which confirmed that atoms exist, which was a debate for quite a while, to be honest. Ernest Rutherford with the nucleus and other things. By the 1930s, though, it took until 1930 for the neutron was discovered. There was quite a gap in particle physics history. So the nucleus was discovered in 1909, 1911. The neutron was discovered about 20 years after that. Why did it take so long? Well, it was really hard to discover. A neutral particle can't be detected by electronics because by its nature, it's neutral. It's literally invisible. And all of our measuring techniques use electronics. So it was very difficult to detect the neutron with their Geiger counters or their phosphors that they had. But the title of the slide saying the incomplete history is not because there's a gap between discovering the nucleus and discovering the neutron. It's because this doesn't tell a good story. It doesn't tell about how the fact that most of these people worked in one person's lab, Ernest Rutherford's lab. So, and as well, during this time, there was a lot of rising tides and tensions in the world. By the time the neutron was discovered in 1930, there was zero conception and conviction that physics could be used nuclear physics could be used in application to the world. Einstein said it would be akin to shooting a bird in the dark in a country where there are not many birds. Rutherford called it moonshine. Rutherford said, although we can use neutrons to transmute elements more easily, they will not be able to release nuclear energy because you would need a huge amount of neutrons and you would need more energy in than out. There was no seen mechanism of releasing energy from the atom. This all changed with Otto Hahn and Lise Meitner's discovery of fission. Let us talk about the full story. So a rising action on two fronts. In 1938, Hahn and Meitner, the two icons on the left, had done a lot of research and had solidified themselves as the best radiochemists in the world and one of the top experimental nuclear physicists. Hahn, the radiochemist, and Meitner, the physicist. They are a very, very good team. And in 1938, Lise Meitner had to leave her job in Austria because something called the Anschluss. So Hitler had risen to power quite a few years before. Many Jews had left Europe. The Anschluss was the official firing of all Jewish people from their academic posts. Lise Meitner, who was like 1/4 or 1/8 Jewish, had to go to her colleagues and say, well, I might be an embarrassment to you. You don't know this, but I am actually Jewish, and I should leave because I'm apt to be an embarrassment. There was a lot of guilt and shame in Europe that wasn't felt in America, a topic we'll talk about later. But the point is, the dream team was broken up. And in that time, in late 1938, Otto Hahn had stumbled upon a really, really strange result. His uranium bombardment, he was bombarding uranium with neutrons, was not reacting the way that Enrico Fermi had predicted. In fact, his chemistry had shown that instead of a regular nuclear reaction happening, after bombarding uranium with neutrons, the uranium seemed to give barium, something half its weight. This was completely unseen before. The laws of radioactive decay could say that, okay, maybe a heavy element can break and have a little piece of it come off, but for the entire thing to be broken up would be like throwing a baseball at the moon and having the moon explode. It was unthinkable. He published his results with a footnote, essentially saying, "Please help." He said, "As chemists, we should really say that barium is created, but as a radiochemist, I know that this goes against all previously established laws of nuclear physics. So someone please help." And Lise Meitner and her cousin, who were in exile in Sweden, came up with the idea that the nuclear was being split. And if it was being split, a lot of energy was released, as well as more neutrons. If more neutrons were released, immediately physicists realized this could be used, possibly make a nuclear chain reaction.
Matt, do we want to maybe pause for just one moment, go back a slide, and maybe explain that this idea was in the air before it was actually discovered in practice? Maybe say just a couple words about Leo Szilard and the mere fact that the concept of the possibility of a nuclear chain reaction existed, but maybe wasn't taken seriously until this discovery was actually made.
Yeah. So Matthew brought up an important person named Leo Szilard. Who is Leo Szilard? No one really knew. To be honest, he wasn't that outstanding of a physicist or famous of a physicist at the time. But Leo Szilard had a really good knack and intuition for both physics and the way the world worked. Here are some iconic moments from his life. Leo Szilard, at age 17, said, "I think there will be a great war, and the result of that war will have the British being the victors." And he was correct. So he predicted the outcome of World War I. Later, I think it was 1934 or 35, after the Nazis had said that they won't be able to pay their war reparations until their colonies are given back, Szilard realized the Nazis were up to no good, and he mailed his friend saying, "Let's meet in this country 2 years before the war." This was in the year 1935. And his friend Michael Polanyi said, what war? And he actually got the date of the war starting accurate to within 4 months. So this guy was very good at predicting things. And the moment that the neutron was discovered, Szilard filed a patent in England for the possibility of releasing nuclear energy by a chain reaction facilitated by a neutron. So we recognize the fact that since the neutron can go into a nucleus quite easily, it might be able to stimulate a nucleus to break up and release more neutrons. So regardless of the actual fission being discovered, Szilard thought, okay, if eventually we discover some reaction that can be stimulated by neutrons to release more neutrons, that's just like starting a forest fire. It's just the idea of if I put one match to a forest and the flame from one tree spreads to another, that would be a chain reaction happening. So we patented something called a nuclear chain reaction facilitated by a neutron. And he kept it secret for several years because he didn't want people to know about it. So Szilard's perspective on how physics should be done was physics like this, that might have the potential to be dangerous, should be kept secret. That was quite controversial to other things. Matthew, should we comment more on that?
No, maybe let's go to the mobilization of the world.
Let's get back to this after. Yes, Matthew, this is your spotlight.
Well, yeah. Interestingly, what happened in the wake of the discovery of nuclear fission and the possibility of a uranium chain reaction, it was recognized fairly quickly in the physics community the possibility that this new scientific idea could be used to create some kind of weapon that was that used the fundamental energy encapsulated in the atom instead of any known chemical properties that were used for traditional explosives like TNT. And this, of course, scared the physicists who, from around the world, had gathered in America and Britain, fleeing Nazi persecution in Europe. We must understand that for a huge number of people in the physics community, as we talked about before, this is an incredibly supportive community that was there for each other. The idea that their peers in Europe were being driven out of their jobs and persecuted on the basis of their religion led to a really big mobilization effort to get these physicists to move either to the United Kingdom or to the United States. We had all these physicists. Einstein had moved there a few years earlier. A number of Hungarians and Germans and Austrians had all come to the United States, who were expressing huge concerns that if this technology was applied by the Germans especially, that it could be used for extreme detriment. What we see on the right side is maybe some kind of dramatization of the drafting of a letter. The physicists, was it Wigner, Nat? And
yeah, it was. Actually, I don't want to say the big three. Wigner,
yeah.
Keller, Szilard, and probably von Neumann.
Who drove to Einstein's house?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 3 Hungarians.
I think it was just Wigner and Szilard drove to Einstein's house to get him to draft a letter to President Roosevelt explaining the necessity of setting up some kind of uranium research program, because it was clear that if the Germans got their hands on this and were able to build a nuclear weapon, that would be not good for the world. So while that particular letter did not have a massive effect, it did at the very least organize a small committee among scientists to discuss the issue of uranium.
However, Matt, can I interject for a second here?
Please.
Just a fact check. They went twice, and on the second occasion, they brought Edward Teller.
I see.
And Edward Teller is the one who said that Einstein was jacked. So in case anyone was curious or would like to know, Einstein came in from sailing, he was topless, and he is ripped.
Absolutely. That's an important thing to know, is that physicists not only appreciated philosophy, they also exercised. Who knew? There was a letter to Franklin Roosevelt. It's not clear that Roosevelt read it right away. It was given to him via some kind of financier. We don't appreciate that today. Physicists have organizations. We have organizations in the government that are responsible for mediating between scientific activities and governmental and military activities. That did not exist at this time. There was no sense of liaison between the scientific community and the government. This was invented by the gentleman that you see on the left. In the leftmost photo, the person standing on the right is Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush was an engineer who had invented something called the differential analyzer, which was an analog computer. That is to say, a computer built not from electronic parts, but from moving parts like gears and pulleys and spinning circles, that was able to compute integrals. The whole purpose of the invention of the computer later was to compute derivatives and integrals, and he invented a prototype of that, an analog one at MIT, and went to found a corporation that later became known as Raytheon, which is a major defense contractor, to produce munitions and other important electronics and technologies. And he, along with the person in the middle of that photo, James Conant, who was at the time the president of Harvard University, they managed to station themselves in the government and receive from President Roosevelt a huge amount of authority to basically coordinate all of the scientific activities in the country, including subsuming the uranium committee that the scientists in America had established. Now, the British were in fact far, far ahead of the Americans on many of these topics. In particular, the scientists Rudolf Peierls and Otto Frisch, both of them European immigrants who had come to Britain to flee persecution, had written a memorandum to their supervisor outlining the possibility of exactly how uranium might be used in a destructive weapon. Now, this letter, along with Britain's superior technology in radar, was brought to American shores in what is called the Szilard mission. Henry Szilard led a mission of scientists and engineers to bring radar and knowledge of the possibility of the atomic bomb to the United States government, to the leading universities, to Vannevar Bush and James Conant. And that, far more than the Einstein letter, was what really mobilized the United States to reorganize its government under the authority of Bush and Conant, set up organizations like the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the National Research and Development Council, these very vague sounding names of organizations that were explicitly for the purpose of organizing and mobilizing scientific knowledge in the service of particular technology that would be used to help in war. Now, the United States at this point in 1941 was technically neutral in the war. As you'll remember from history, the United States did not actually join World War II until after the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the United States was nevertheless supporting its European allies in terms of munitions and knowledge. But the British recognized, especially after they had been blitzed in the early part of the war by Germany, the British recognized that if they were going to have any chance of succeeding technologically, and especially if nuclear weapons were to come into play, they would absolutely need the full support of the entire American infrastructure. Niels Bohr once said that if there was going to be the possibility of an atomic bomb, it would require the resources of a nation. You couldn't just build it in one state. You couldn't just build it in one small country. It would require an entire industrial scale, countrywide, massive, multi-hundred facility, gigantic mobilization effort. And that is what the British inspired the Americans to do in the Szilard mission, in which the people on your left, Vannevar Bush, James Bryant Conant, and Leslie Groves, who was a military officer who had helped with the design of the Pentagon and was known for his ruthless efficiency, leadership, and no nonsense, no BS attitude, eventually managed to get this question of both radar development and nuclear development to the highest echelons of government clearance, so that it was basically just the president and then these guys. And so they were able to, in 1942 and into 1943, start the process of setting up research and manufacturing sites around the country to refine uranium, produce plutonium, build sites from all of the major manufacturers around the nation, including in collaboration with Canada. Our nuclear research facilities in Montreal and at Chalk River played an integral part in a lot of this work. And then, just for the story of science, one of the most important things that happened in this time is in late 1942, when Leslie Groves recruited the man you see in the middle, J. Robert Oppenheimer, to be the scientific leader of what then became called the Manhattan Project, after the Manhattan Engineering District, which just happened to be the Army Corps of Engineers base that had an office in New York City. And so because that was being set up in Manhattan, it became known as the Manhattan Project, under the scientific leadership of Robert Oppenheimer, and under the military leadership of Leslie Groves to the left. And this would go on to become an almost unfathomably massive project in terms of its transformation of the government's ability to interface directly with and influence the priorities and work of science. Influential in that regard, influential in terms of just the sheer capital and human labor investment that was involved in the uranium and plutonium plants in Oak Ridge and Hanford, Washington, respectively. And in terms of the sheer level of secrecy involved in the project. Maybe I'll just touch on this now, because we are actually running out of time. Not only was the Manhattan Project a secret, there are a lot of things that are a secret. We know about the CIA, there's things the CIA does that is a secret, but we at least know that the CIA exists. The Manhattan Project was not only a secret, the mere fact of its existence was a secret. So this meant that if you were someone who was driving through New Mexico and happened to drive by Los Alamos and you said, "What's that?" you couldn't say, "Oh, it's a secret government project," because now you've given away the existence of the secret in the first place. So
yeah, how do you do it?
Just extreme levels of organization, and different people knew different amounts. Many of the tens or hundreds of thousands of people working for the Manhattan Project had no idea what they were working for. So there was much to be told here about how they established the site at Los Alamos, New Mexico, to be the location for this scientific research to take place. There was a great deal about the life of Robert Oppenheimer and how he ended up in this extremely unique position of leading this massive project, even though for much of his life prior, he would have been deemed by his superiors and friends to be totally unfit for the job. How this scientific, military, academic, and industrial collaboration really began in World War II, and how it continued after. But I'm going to pause there because I am mindful of the time.
Yeah, well, I think this is probably the crux of the presentation. As much as I'd like to talk about the quirks of Robert Oppenheimer, we should probably pause on this. Let's open up the floor for questions. And
can you share the questions that people post to the panelists? Oh, I'm see. There are questions here. I wasn't able to.
Yes, I responded. Okay, yeah. So someone sent me a question, and I responded to all participants.
I'm seeing a question.
So I'm just going to briefly talk. So if Griffin's okay, he's a friend of mine. I'm going to give consent on his behalf. Griffin asked me a question. Oh, he asked all participants. Oh, no, did he ask just me or everyone? Well, regardless.
Okay, everyone. There's a question here that's only visible to us, which is, and this is a very important question, Angela. Thank you for asking it. Do you think that the selection and setup of these sites would have been different if women and minorities, particularly indigenous peoples, were considered? Nat, do you want to say a little bit about the selection of the site of Los Alamos for the Manhattan Project and its relationship with the territory around it? In particular related to indigenous and people and immigrants in the area.
I'm just going to leave it on this slide, Matthew. These are iconic slides that I don't want to cut out of the presentation. So sure. On this slide is the cover of a book called.
Don't worry about it. Novum Organum by Francis Bacon.
So Matt,
do you want to? Would you like to speak on that? Would you like to speak about Los Alamos?
Yes. Okay. I'll get directly to it. Okay. So essentially, I was going to go through this way. This is a book written by Francis Bacon about science. It's like the pinnacle of enlightenment books about what science should be. And on the cover of it is a colonial ship. So for a while, science has had a finger in colonialism. Essentially, the Enlightenment gave birth to science, but it also gave birth to colonialism. They're cousins. They're maybe even sisters. So in the question of, is science inherently good? Well, you can be a pure scientist, indeed, but the process of it requires lots of resources, lots of people, and oftentimes if you're a colonial nation, it means lots of colonialism. Los Alamos was definitely built on grounds that were owned by native people, but also a lot of the dangerous work in construction and storage of nuclear waste was recruited by the people who lived there, mostly indigenous people. There's a reserve right where or Los Alamos was built on a reserve, and these people went through a lot of hardships, a lot of strange, sicknesses and things as they're dealing with nuclear waste in order to build this secret town in the middle of nowhere. Did I capture that, Matthew?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Nat and I, in our travels, drove through Jemez Springs, which is a town right near Los Alamos, and it's very interesting to see, in particular, how well one of the reasons Los Alamos was chosen as the location for this is precisely because of the large indigenous and largely Mexican immigrant population, because they could be mobilized for physical labor. This is not a part of this story that is often told in the kind of scientific hagiography or mythologization of the story of the atomic bomb. But there's no question that it's an essential aspect of this work and is absolutely inseparable from the scientific work. So I appreciate you drawing attention to that. There's a question being asked here. Might it be possible to elaborate on how the nanoscale industry is influenced by the Manhattan Project? Matt, can you go to the next slide? This is a slide that shows the training of physicists after World War II. So basically, after the Second World War, the number of PhDs granted to physicists expanded dramatically. You can see in the 1950s it goes up. In the 1960s, 70s, it absolutely skyrockets. Now, this is not because the United States government decided out of the goodness of its heart that its most interesting, the thing that it is most concerned with is the truth of the universe and the fundamental inner workings of our galaxy and world. This is because physics and all scientific funding after World War II soon fell under the remit of the Department of Defense. In the 1960s, Dwight Eisenhower founded an agency called ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency, later called DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which had a nearly unlimited budget from the United States government to fund physics, engineering, and the development of nuclear technology. The idea behind the training of all these physicists was that we were in a Cold War. The United States was becoming a heavily technologized, militarized, and nuclear nation, and that required an insane amount of engineering and physics acumen, and that required the training of physicists. So all of this money, now we need to think about this in the context of the history of scientific funding. If you were Galileo, you were funded by private patrons who you were almost an artist who had to find someone to pay for your work. By this time, you are funded almost exclusively, if you're in physics, by the government, either the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy evolved from the Atomic Energy Commission, which was a community of scientists formed after the war to try to advocate for the peaceful use of nuclear power. But this was later transformed into the Department of Energy, which is responsible for maintaining the United States nuclear stock, and the Department of Defense. So all of this money is being poured into physics and chemistry and engineering and indeed nanotechnology research, because the government understands that this is what is going to lead to military and technological superiority. Even to this day, the Trump administration's budget last year cut funding for almost all science. Donald Trump is not a friend of science, which is not a surprise to any of us, except for quantum materials, quantum information, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. Now, this is not because the Trump administration is interested in qubits. It is because there's a recognition that this kind of scientific research is the type that will lead to profit in military work. So that is one relationship between today's nano industry. Another is the sheer size of physics as we understand it. If we zoom back to the Cavendish, or even before, science is a very small scale enterprise involving just a few people. In the wake of the 1940s and World War II, science has become a massive, in terms of money, in terms of number of people, in terms of global scope industry that involves hundreds, thousands, or millions of people working in collaboration. If we think of sites like the Large Hadron Collider, or even the microscopes that most scientists use in their day-to-day life, are huge enterprises that are unprecedented in the scope of scientific history before World War II. So recognizing that, for instance, the idea of hundreds of people working on the same project at the Large Hadron Collider and multi-hundred person authors, and even then, those are not all the people doing the science. There are lab technicians, there are workers, there are secretarial and administrative staff who don't have actual direct citation in the scientific literature, but are all part of this really gigantic process. Those are the ways in which we can see the kind of legacies of this World War II business affecting science in the present day, and they are all direct legacies of this Manhattan Project transformation. So scientists largely only really think about this in the context of submitting applications for grants, or every time they need to consider where their funding is coming from. But we believe that it's definitely a crucial part of and maybe neglected part of scientific education to recognize that this military industrial scientific academic complex is a very real phenomenon to this day, and we as scientists are not immune.
We'd like to formally thank everyone for coming